Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Sunday. I hope everybody, if you're living in St. Louis or anywhere, I think kind of in the Midwest, I know Timothy's also having this weather. I hope you're getting to enjoy a really beautiful Sunday weather-wise, and also that you've remembered to do your taxes, because that is important if somebody hasn't pointed that out to you up until this point in the day. And if you did get to do your taxes already, I hope you got to enjoy the weather and that you're having an awesome Sunday. My name is Stephanie. I'm the director of events for The Novel Neighbor. We're an independently owned bookstore located in Webster Groves, Missouri, which is basically St. Louis, Missouri, if you're not familiar. And we are super excited. We are getting to do a virtual event with one of our favorite authors. We have been longtime fans of his work. The Novel Neighbor Book Club read one of his books very early on into my tenure as leading the book club, and it was definitely one of our fan favorites when it first came out. And so we've been anxiously anticipating this newest book, and then we found out that we were going to get to do a virtual event with him, which was even more exciting because I think there's so much to hear about. I know from his previous process in The Perfume Thief that he's going to just tell us so many interesting things. We're going to learn so much about his process behind his writing. And so I just can't wait. The person I'm talking about, of course, is Timothy Schaffert, who grew up on a farm in Nebraska and now lives in Omaha. He is the author of The Swan Gondola, as well as 4 previously critically acclaimed novels, which have been among Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Selections, Indie Next Picks, and New York Times Editors' Choices. Schaffert teaches creative writing, and literature at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And we are here today to celebrate his newest release, which is the Titanic Survivors Book Club. So please help me welcome Timothy. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, of course. How are you?
I'm great.
Are you getting to enjoy some lovely weather where you are as well, right? It's pretty nice.
It's like summer out there. But,
We're in April. We're not alarmed at all. It's totally fine.
right, that's right. I forgot my hat when I was out and about, so I'm a little worried about.
Oh no. I know. I'm not used to having to wear like sunblock and protection this early in the season. Yeah, so that's a fair worry.
Yes, wear your sunblock, everyone. It's
This is really what we came here to say. This is the important message today. Wear sunblock. Timothy, are you a golfer, a Master Sunday golf watcher at all, or no?
No, my list of hobbies is so sadly sparse. I I read and I write and I have a martini, and that's
I think that's like great hobbies though. That's like a really, really high. Are you a vodka martini person or a gin martini person?
Gin, Tanqueray specifically. Yeah, Tanqueray. I mean, there's so many different varieties of gin. And this actually is something that the characters talk about in the book. They end up talking about gin too. But yeah, I like the closer it tastes to hair tonic, the better I like it. So the more botanical ones, the more flavorful ones I can't take.
That's very much our owner and I, Holland Saltzman, we're both big gin drinkers. And I do think that people who are not gin drinkers don't realize like kind of the range of gin that is out there. And every so often she'll get gifted this beautiful but very floral gin. And she's like, I can't do it. That's not her. I'm a little bit more flexible, but she's very much like, I think, similar to your end. And certainly I can't do that in a martini. I like a very, like you said, hair tonic-y martini is really, my husband's notorious for making those in our household. And they're, at every party, they get a little stronger the further you go into the evening.
Yeah. I've in my old age, I'm easing back on it, but they might as well call it like 2 a.m. anxiety, because that's when I end up waking up in the middle of the night worrying about things that don't matter. So
really relatable. Okay, well, they do talk about gin in your book, but let's talk about your book a little bit more. Tell the people, if they haven't heard of this book, or if they're hearing about it for the first time right now, what is your book about?
So it's called the Titanic Survivors Book Club, and the narrator is a bookseller named Yorick. who also happened to have been the library steward of the second-class library on the Titanic. And he was reassigned at the last minute. And so when he survived, he saw this as an opportunity to follow his dream and open a bookshop in Paris. And then he gets invited to this mysterious club that turns out to be other people who were supposed to be on the Titanic but weren't. And so, and what emerges from that is an actual book club as a way to kind of talk about their experience, talk about their feelings, their luck, their sense of fate, but through the characters of books. So it felt like a kind of safe remove for these characters.
Mm-hmm.
What emerges is a bit of a romantic entanglement among the three.
Yes. And I will say we will definitely keep it spoiler free for the people today. But I almost want to start like a second live so that when people do go read it, they can get back and talk about all of the things that they've read, which is why your books are so perfect for book clubs. There's so much to discuss. I was telling you in the green room, but it's been very fun. Several of us at the Novel Neighbor are reading it, and that doesn't always get to happen with books because there's so many books to read that sometimes we feel like we have to kind of divide and conquer in terms of like making sure that we're reading as widely as possible, and we all trust each other's opinions. So it's kind of like if I say a book is good, my coworkers believe me, but don't always necessarily go read that themselves because they're trying to find ones that they can contribute so that we can be these well-rounded booksellers. All of that to say, we don't always get to like, you kind of have to decide in conversations if you get to be spoilery or not for somebody who hasn't read it. And
Right.
so it's been very fun that we kind of have like our secondary like Novel Neighbor employee book club all reading your book right now and then getting to come in every day and talk about it.
I love it. Thank you so much.
I want
Well,
to.
that's sort of like how the character of the book has emerged too. Is like, I mean, I've been writing books for 20 years, and the role of the booksellers is so incredibly important. I mean, I don't know how much you know that when you're just writing books or dreaming of being a writer, a student of writing or whatever, but you're kind of writing with these ambitions, or you're writing towards the books that have inspired you. But there's this whole other realm of the people who need to like um, fall in love with your book and tell people about it, right? And so it's been I feel like I owe my entire career to booksellers because it's been through that process that I've been able to really connect with readers. Otherwise, I mean, the bookseller is that bridge between the writer and the reader in a big way.
Wow, you're making a bookseller's hearts very happy right now.
So I try to put all of that into all of those sentiments into this book too.
No, it's really hard. Definitely something that we've been discussing is sometimes it can actually be hard as a bookseller to read books that have booksellers as the main character. I found that it's particularly difficult if it's done in a contemporary way because there's so many different things. Like, you can never expect somebody to write. Sometimes like the decision is what's best for the story, but it's just not like true to our experience. And you kind of have to like be able to get over that or you can't. And it's just like tricky. I imagine it's similar to sometimes like doctors talk about like it's hard to, they never watch Grey's Anatomy. Like that's, difficult. And yet that's like what, a show that I will consume, just like give it to me in my veins. And so I feel like you really captured that essence for us. Like that sentiment is so clear. And our bookseller that is featured in this book is just he's so close to my heart. I love him so much. But I guess let's talk about what is, even before we get to the book, I imagine to have gotten to writing this novel, you previously had some affinity for the Titanic. Is that true? Or how did the Titanic kind of become a part of this initially?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could remember kind of like when I first had a sense of the Titanic, but I think we all, or most of us, I suppose, it's such a part of our culture, our world culture. It's such a legend that I suspect that we all kind of learn about it at a young age at some point. But I do remember reading a book. Back in the day, they would have like paperbacks, like spiral racks of paperbacks in the grocery store or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are particular kinds of books that are on those spiral racks. And I feel like I picked up when I was a kid a Titanic novel, but I of course would have no idea what that was. But And I tried to find it, and it's trying to sort through the history of Titanic books is a little challenging. But so I think that was uh, I think that probably played a part in it. And then and then after, yeah, I grew up pretty much fascinated with it. And then when they made the James Cameron movie, there was a sense of like, um, I don't know. I was kind of opposed to it initially. I don't know why, but there was something like, oh, it's just gonna, be a disaster. But
So funny. I get you go see it in theaters after that?
well,
Okay.
I did see it. I saw it when it came, probably the weekend it came out, and I saw it many times after. I saw the 3D version when I did that. So I'm a big aficionado. I have many problems with the film. Make no mistake. It's definitely a sentimental favorite.
Um, yeah, I was telling you this too, of like just thinking about Titanic I don't remember. I think the first Titanic book I read was there's this very old series that I can still find copies of. I don't think they're like printing them anymore, but like if you go to Half Price Books, you can definitely still find them. They're called the Dear America Diaries. And they were all epistolary novels, but you were just like they ended up making a boy series, but initially it was just like different girls. It dropped into different time periods, and you just read their diary entries and learned about it that way. And so I think that might have been the first Titanic novel I ever read, where it was somebody who was on the Titanic. I don't remember how it ended. I know it's downstairs. I forgot that I meant to go see like whether she makes it or not, because I
Oh no.
like said like
I hope so.
what did I read? So I think that was my first Titanic book, and then not too long after that, I think I saw the movie for the first time, and um I used to only watch tape one because I would get so upset. Like tape one was so fun, and I felt like you got like so much from it. And then tape two, I would always just be like a disaster afterwards. My mom would be like, "Why are you still watching this?" And also, like, we did know how it ended. Like, just to be clear, you did know that this was coming. Um,
When I grew up in the 70s, that was the whole disaster movie era. So the airport movies, the Poseidon Adventure and the Towering Inferno. And so I remember being particularly fascinated, probably perversely fascinated with those two, but then so was everybody else. But
exactly. Yeah, it's hello, my dog is making
yes, the puppies.
he's just popping in and out whatever he would like. Okay, so that's your background with the Titanic. How did the idea for this book come along? Because it's a pretty interesting way to incorporate some of what we love about the Titanic, but it's a very different story than that. Like the Titanic itself, is not. It has played a pivotal role in the individuals who are in the characters in this book's lives, but it's not necessarily. I guess it's hard because it's not really. It is the main focus, that's also not the main focus at the same time. It feels like it's a thing that has brought all of them together, but we're getting so much other information about their lives, and it is it's impacting them, but it's not the focal. It's not like we're on the Titanic in this story.
Right.
So
I hope people aren't returning the book saying, "Wait a minute, this says Titanic, but nobody was on the Titanic." But
we
yeah,
haven't had that experience yet, so I don't think that's happening. I'll keep you posted.
so it was a book actually that has existed in different forms over a number of years, or at least the idea of introducing Titanic, and to the point where I can't even really remember what made me think that I should write a book about it. But I at one point was working on a book that was about a silent filmmaker in the 1920s who was making a film of the Titanic in the deserts of California, and I spent years writing that book, and then it just didn't congeal. There was something missing. It wasn't, and so I moved on to The Perfume Thief, because I thought that I could write that quickly. I was wrong. I didn't write it terribly quickly, and so then I thought, well, maybe I'll go back to that other book and figure it out. Like I'll figure out how to make it work. And so I ended up coming up with this whole other concept that involved a bookseller And that's really when I introduced the concept of people who had tickets but didn't board.
Okay.
And so that was in the proposal, because the editor that I worked with at Doubleday, I had talked to her about some ideas I was having, and eventually sometimes you write the whole book and then try to sell it, but then a couple of times in my career I've written a proposal and some sample chapters, and then they buy it, which is great because you have the deal, but then you have a deadline. And so so that was the case with this, whereas I drew up the kind of the concept and tried to incorporate again this 1920s movie version of the Titanic. And my editors responded to all the new stuff in the proposal, but the stuff that I already written did not actually appeal. So in conversation and figuring it all out, eventually became like, no, what we really want to do, or what the book really needs, is to be set entirely in this Paris bookshop that is kind of suggested at the beginning of my proposal. And so I started thinking about how these things could kind of emerge. And it was actually my editor who said, well, yeah, and the title could be something like the Titanic Book Club. And so it was, so the book club actually emerged from the concept of the bookseller, and then then you had the challenge of figuring out, well, what book should they talk about? And so I asked my editor, like, well, what do you think? Should I? Because my first instinct was just make them all up, like just not real books at all. And she's like, no, I think readers would really want to respond to the work that they're writing. So then the next question is like, well, how alienating is it for a reader to read about a book club that's discussing a book that they've not read themselves? And so I wanted to avoid that kind of alienation or frustration, but at the same time communicate something about the book and have them talk about it in a way that that speaks to their own sense of destiny and their own emotional state, and that would lead to the conversations that they might have. Because another thing I've done over the years is I've visited a lot of book clubs. I don't belong to one myself, but I've been to a lot of them, and so I've had an opportunity to see what happens when people get together to talk about books. And so I definitely wanted to try to capture that element too. I mean, the kind of book clubs that we have now were really not quite in practice back in 1913 when this book was set. There were book societies and salons and that sort of thing, but just a group of people just sitting around talking about books was really not quite the same tradition as it is now. So it was a bit of a process then of, the thing when you're writing historical fiction is that, yeah, you want to keep it historical. You want to keep to the facts. You really want to capture that moment and that experience. But at the same time, you're trying to even that you're writing towards the readers of today who have certain concepts and of what the conventions of a good novel are. So it's a balance, I guess.
Well, and I think it's a balance that you strike so well. I was wondering when the book club itself would come up, because I was intrigued that these were books that I recognized. Like, I hadn't necessarily read them, but I was kind of like, they are familiar, and like I do understand that I'm a bookseller. But I think that that's not really a part. Like, I do think that the selections that you have chosen are like something that people have heard about before. And I think that was really brilliant. Like, I was thinking about that historical fiction. We talk about this a lot in our book club, of just the line that you have to ride of like, it is historical. You're also telling us a story. And sometimes what's best for the story, as I said earlier, is like a different choice than might necessarily be completely factual, or we don't have all the facts. Like, there's a lot to fill in about what we don't know from history. And so I just think that you really keep us so engaged. And that is your choices as far as that goes. And also, I am so invested in your characters all the time. This is not my first book of yours that I have read. Like I said, we are diehards at Novel Neighbor Book Club for The Perfume Thief. And so one, I was intrigued that you went back to France. This is not the first time that you've written a book in France. And so I was wondering about that a little bit, but largely, how do you choose your cast of characters? Because we get to know, I mean, we've talked about our bookseller. our dear bookseller York. But there's also so many other the people in the book club and other characters that are a part of it. And so how did you get to know them? What is your process for getting to know your characters before and after you put them on page?
Well, some of it's through the writing process and just sitting down and typing it out. So I don't have a terribly clear sense of the characters until I'm really letting them engage with each other. And so I always start every book in the wrong place. Like I think maybe my first book, actually, the first paragraph that I wrote of it was remained the first paragraph ultimately, but otherwise, they I end up writing for a while kind of in the wrong direction.
Okay.
And so I started the book um, with Yorick as a child. The narrator's talking about his childhood and then how eventually he kind of came to own the bookshop. And then I was going to have him kind of backtrack. And I thought, well, he needs to get with this book club a little sooner than that. And so, um, so yeah, but at that point, I kind of knew who he was. I knew what his background was. I knew what his conflicts were, his confrontations, his disappointments, his loves, his losses, and so that helped. So that when I did then decide to kind of put that all aside and then started so that we were entered into this club a little bit earlier, then I just started having him just walk into a room of people, and then those people started talking. And so that chapter remains that chapter is pretty close to the very to the chapter that I just wrote. So those characters really did just start responding to each other. I had a sense of a couple of them that I knew. I like the Zinnia, who's the other main character in the book. I knew I wanted to draw from just the Japanese culture that my friend Janet and her mother Akimi had introduced me to over the years, and Japanese candy and Japanese food, and so and history, and so that character was a concept that I had in mind, and then the third in this triangle. I needed somebody kind of mysterious, I guess, and somebody sort of inexplicably desirable, I guess. Once they start in conversation, once they start going to places, once they start making observations, then their characters get set into place, I think. Sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you think, oh, no, this character's going in a direction that I don't want them to go. We're going to go back in and soften their dialogue or introduce a little more anxiety or a little more trepidation or whatever it is that you need so that they're not too confident or not too underconfident, but so it does become a balance, but at the same time, I don't think you want necessarily to mess with that alchemy all that much. I think you really do want it to come from the imagination.
Yeah. I said we'll keep it spoiler free, so I'm trying to frame this question in a way that you can answer it without, but like as a person reading it, is there a character that we can keep in mind that surprised you the most, even if you can't tell us like why they surprised you?
Yes, there was. He ends up with an assistant, Yorick, the bookseller, does, and she doesn't play a very big part in the book, but she was never any part of it whatsoever as I was writing it. And then once she kind of showed up, she became very useful, and she just sort of asserted herself usefully in ways where it needed a particular twist or this needs to happen somehow. How should it happen? Oh, well, so she was pretty surprising.
I always love hearing that because I just think about us as a reader, like we don't know how many edits or drafts, or like maybe we do, but we don't understand what you've gone through in your process. Like what we're getting is the finished story. And so to me, I'm just like, this is exactly how it was always supposed to be. This is the only version of this story that I know. And so I think it's very fun even to go into reading it, like not just keeping in mind like something that surprised you as the author, so that I could be like, whoa, I always expected this assistant to be there. This is all I know. it to be, and then to hear that that was like a surprise to you, I think is such a fun thing to keep in the back of our minds as we're reading through something.
And so much of it ends up being a surprise in the process, especially when you're doing research. And so sometimes I go looking for one thing, and then I find these other things in the historical archive that just lends itself so well to the story. And so sometimes I'm looking for something specific. Like I think, oh, I want this to happen, but I don't know if that was commonplace. I didn't know, since I don't know if this would make sense in terms of
Mhm.
the historical fact. And then something will present itself. Like you'll find a paragraph of description in the historical record where you're like, oh, well, that actually fits thematically. I can draw from that, you know. So, I find myself so often very immersed just in historical research, far beyond the amount that I need to do, simply because it does just hold so much potential surprise, you know, in those materials.
I think I first tell everybody watching at the beginning, please feel free. I'll give you another prompt at the end, but if anything that we're discussing you want to hear us talk a little bit more about, like please feel free to throw a question in the comment section from whatever platform you're watching this on. I'll make sure I feed that question, especially if it's like what we're currently talking about. So please use that, or even if you just want to comment. I know somebody said LOL earlier when we were talking about gin martinis. Feel free to throw all that in there. I know virtual events are hard because we don't get to see you. So be as active as you want in there. Timothy, I want to go to talking about your research process, which you just like brought up, and I was very excited for us to go there. I was wondering what your research process is like in general, and if anything about it was different for this book, or what.
Yeah, I mean, especially writing about Paris when I don't really read French so well. So some of those questions, those historical questions I always anticipate that they might be answered somewhere in the record in French that I can't necessarily read. Now, of course, the Google Translator app helps when I can just hold it up to the screen and it does give me an approximation of
Okay.
what I'm trying to read, and that has been helpful. But yeah, it's I look at a lot of times I go into Google Books, and you can limit the search to the 19th century or 1850 to 1912 or whatnot, and that can be enormously helpful. I can look in the Internet Archive. I can look in newspapers.com, and then I use the library. I go look at the physical books, and I order the books through interlibrary loan. And so it ends up being just I do a lot of reading, and then in addition, there were the books themselves that they were to discuss. And so that was kind of an audition process too, where I was thinking, oh, well, maybe we'll include this book, and then you read it and you try to figure out, and some books just really announce themselves as vital to the club. And even some lines you would come across and be like, oh, the characters have to reflect on this. Yeah, so.
I was wondering how you selected those, which we talked about a little bit earlier, even. But just like, have you read all of the books that they discussed in some, not necessarily all the way through, but not to put you on the spot, but like, have you mostly read through all of them, and that's how you chose them?
Yeah, so the books that they're actually including in the club I've read, and then there are other books that are mentioned here and there, that some that I haven't necessarily read. York gives a speech when his bookshop kind of officially reopens, and they have a little party, and he stands on the steps and talks about a book by Karl May that was banned because there was too much character death in it. Like somebody did a count, and there were 2,000 characters dead by the end of it. So that book, I confess, I've not read, but yeah, and it was, you mean, there are worse kinds of research to do, right? To have to sit down and read great books. So it was, and I think I could have. I mean, there was an inclination to include even more, to have more meetings, but you can't just write a book about characters just sitting around talking about book after book after
I
book.
mean, if you wrote it, I would read it, but I think that's a good point. Probably not. Do you remember, is there like a specific research rabbit hole that you went down, even if it didn't make it inside the book, that you just like kept going after because it was so interesting? Or were you able to like keep yourself out of going down any research rabbit holes?
You know, the thing that really fascinated me were the details of book publishing and publishers of books around that period, like around the turn of the century. So I, I read a lot more than I needed to about the publication history of the Picture of Dorian Gray, for example,
Mhm.
and its history in Paris specifically, and looking at through rare and used booksellers, and then also trying to form my narrative around that, what books are for sale now and how they're marked, and trying to bring some order to
Mhm.
all of that when there just simply might not be any order, you know, that and so so there were like, after Oscar Wilde's death, there were kind of bootleg copies, there were official copies that were nonetheless published by a publisher who was better known for basically like erotica, and a somewhat underground publisher, and also just the history of um, the publication of The Awakening, which is the book by Kate Chopin that they read first. And I do have York speak like at one point about that publisher, and but that there's but I discovered this book about the role that that publishing company played in the history of literary publishing, how it was kind of the first American publisher to really devote only to novels and short fiction, and as opposed to being a kind of conglomerate that published cookbooks and guidebooks and all of that, this was somebody who was very focused on creating a really lovely artifact, a book that you would want to read and fall in love with and keep, and focus only on those kinds of special books that the editors appeal to the editors. And so that just the fact that there was a book to read about that publisher was kind of fascinating. And that book is very detailed and has all kinds of information that I found fascinating, but was really minutia, you know. But it all fed my sense of the history of not just American publishing, but French publishing and French bookselling, and the role of the French bookseller in history at that time, and you know, the centuries beforehand, and so that was a never ending, never and always I was always tumbling into that rabbit hole.
I can only imagine, because I was just thinking about, as you were talking about that, Simon and Schuster has been putting out some really interesting stuff because they're celebrating their 100th year. And so one of the bookseller newsletters that they like sent out to us had the original, like, I don't remember what it was exactly, but I think it was some of the original editorial notes for Catch 22.
Oh yeah.
And you could read through, you know, and it was like a scan of a sheet of paper. And it's a little hard to read because it's also in cursive. And so you're like trying to decipher. At the time, I think they hadn't even decided that it was going to be called Catch 22. And it's just interesting to see some of the background conversations that they were having about this book that we now know, you know, went on to be a huge part of our cultural lexicon. And we know it was wildly successful and all of this stuff. And so I was thinking about that when you were talking, of just how I do think that's really fascinating, especially because publishing has evolved so much. And I would have a hard time not going down that rabbit hole myself. Just
Oh,
trying.
and coincidentally, I've spent the day with Sarah Crichton, the legendary editor, and she's in. We try to engage our students with publishing professionals in our graduate program at the University of Nebraska in the creative writing program there, and so she's kindly consented to meet with our students this week and consult with them. And so, so yeah, so I eat up all her stories of you know, the experience of discovering writers, bringing those books out into the world, and but yeah, it's and I don't know if you've watched the TV show Julia about Julia Child, but you know, that gets into this interesting avenue of publishing because it has Julia Child's editor Judith Jones, who's working with Blanche Knopf, played by Judith Light, and it's just like I'm sure it doesn't resemble the facts at all, probably, but but I just eat it up, you know.
No, it's funny you bring that up. I'm a big Meryl Streep fan. And so I've seen Julie and Julia like a million times. And so then when they said that they were going to do Julia, the show on HBO, I was like, I don't understand. Like, we've already had Meryl Streep play Julia Child. Like, what story are we telling? And now I'm obsessed with it because it's very different than what I like understood it to be. And I think that I, again, also do not know the facts either. I think what they're telling me are facts are very interesting. And it seems like some really, because I just feel like we talk about Julia Child's success, and that show is more about like how hard it was actually to make that successful and the ways in which like a lot of things were not coming together. I also think everybody loves to talk about Julia Child's husband, and he was great, but like that show kind of makes it a little bit more nuanced, where you're like, this is why they made it. It's fascinating, and I'm sure like it's factually incorrect, but we'll pretend it is. Did you have to go through a lot of, speaking of factually correct, was there a lot of copy editing and like edits specifically around making sure that you had all of the facts in this book accurate? Like how does that process work for you as a historical fiction author?
Well, yeah, the copy editor goes through and makes notes, and it's funny too, because when you're writing a first-person novel and they're drawing from their own experience, sometimes they make historical mistakes that you don't necessarily want to change, even if they're not factual. You know? So there was a kind of moment when, one of my characters pontificates that the words. Now I'm forgetting exactly what the fact was, but it had something about like that the word evolved from a kind of a cloak that this kind of charlatan, I think was the word that emerged from the word scarlet or something, because somebody wore a scarlet coat, and the copy editor marked it and said, well, I think that this is a fantasy. I don't think this is true. And so, and the thing is, it very well might not be, but it was a detail that I found in a book about bookselling that Yorick would likely have read. So and since he's the one who's telling the story, and since he's the one who's and I think it's even a line of dialogue. So I figured that in some instances it's okay to stray from the facts, but other times, yeah, they'll find something that, and that's the thing. It was the same case with the Perfume Thief, and then the Swan Gondola before that, where they'll point out something that seems just a little bit anomalous, or something that didn't occur to me to look up. So because sometimes I try really hard to look up words and phrases that to make sure that they would have been used in that time, and but sometimes you just don't realize that word or phrase hasn't always been in existence until the copy editor indicates that, well, this wasn't referenced until the 40s or something like that. But you also learn like how many of the expressions that we use originate either with Shakespeare or with the 1920s and flapper culture. So.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't think I realized that was true, but that makes a lot of sense. It's also, I feel like often when I'm reading a book is when I find out that I've had the phrase wrong this whole time. Like,
right.
I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but I know there's like a couple times where even I'll just say to our friends, like, did you know this is what the phrase actually is? And they're like, interesting. I know it just happened to me the other day. I really wish I could come up with what the phrase was. Where I think if you say it quickly, like it can just become, I'm sure somebody was saying it that way, but what I heard was different, and it's just evolved into like what I say now. And what was it? It
matched different words to the sounds.
Yeah, it was. It was something around jerry rigged or Jimmy rigged. Something like I like that's what I thought it was, and I was like, that's completely not what it is. Like, so very funny. Or at least it was funny to me. My question for you, since we have talked about your creative writing program and the fact that you teach at a university, is just for people who, I know that you're in a creative writing role, and so this might be a little bit different, but for people who have authoring is not their only career, or they are trying to become an author and they are dealing with a full-time job. Like, how do you balance your writing time versus these other, especially like academia, as we know, has many things that you don't just get to go into an office and write every day. How do you balance all of that and find time to write for yourself?
Well, technically it is part of your job when you're at a Research One university. A certain percentage of your hours is to commit to work that you do. But you're right, it doesn't work out that way because, um, so many different aspects of the job demand so much of you. And especially since it's kind of semester by semester, you feel in a rush to get everything done before the semester's over. And so it does end up taking kind of and so like it's so I don't sleep much really. So I probably sleep dangerously too little. But so I write a lot in the morning. I like writing when it's dark anyway. So the winter months when I can get up at 4 or 5 or whatever and just write is really, you can get a lot done before the day even really starts. So, and then, summers and but with this book, like I said, I had a deadline. And so I couldn't really, mess around. I really had to roll up my sleeves and make time for it. And yeah, it was pretty much any given moment I used to work on that book. I mean, I was writing in longhand on the airplane, traveling from one place to the next. So it's and then, and then but it also then still has to fit the world of the story. I mean, you can't just be writing pages to write pages to meet a deadline. It all so there was a sense the whole time like I'm not going to meet this deadline, and it's just they're going to have to push it back like 5 years or something. But um, my editor worked with me, and she was kind of reading pages as they came along, and so some of that editing we did. On the fly, so to speak. So it was a really different way for me to write a novel, but I don't think the results were that much different. I think it's just it got done perhaps a little more efficiently when yeah, when you want to spend days and days reading about like you because the characters have to walk into like a dessert shop or something, and you want to spend days and days reading about what the 2 or 3 details that you want to include in that description. So there's just really not time for that. And so some of the side pleasures that one takes from writing, you kind of have to you can't be too self-indulgent. You have to really keep your nose to the grindstone. But
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I definitely feel like I've heard stories similar to that where like you read something or even like it made it into the initial draft and then your editor has to come through and be like, all of this is done. And you're like, but I read a whole thing for to put that paragraph together and now you're just cutting it out of the story.
If I had a nickel for every time, then and there were and the thing is like in some instances I agree, I ultimately agreed with her,
Mhm.
I mean in almost all instances I agreed with her, and then but there were literally just like a couple of places that she marked that I should cut where I was like I just can't do it. I mean I feel like to me this does feel vital. And then I actually in preparation for some of these conversations, I did reread the book because I realized that you can't always remember what's in there and what's not. And so I felt like I wanted a better sense of the book when I went to talk about it. So I sat and reread it all, and those places announced themselves. It's like, oh, that's right, Kara suggested I cut this, and I'm like, oh, I should have cut
Oh,
that paragraph.
oh
And
no.
usually it's in service to kind of uh, you know increasing the jolt of electricity of the book really is like sometimes your editor wants you to kind of just jump ahead so that the reader isn't kind of overwhelmed by a lot of historical detail when you have this moment to move things forward. And
Mhm.
so that was kind of so that and you don't and as the writer you don't always see that when you're in the thick of it.
I feel like that is incredibly unique. Well, first of all, we won't show your editor this, so we won't tell her on the record that you said your editor was correct. We'll keep that between the people watching and you and I.
I think she knows. I think she knows.
I knew I was right all along. I don't need your validation, is what she's saying into the event right now. Fair. But yeah, is there anything that you still think about that was cut, even if it was for the right reasons, but like it's just like when you were rereading your book, you were like, I know what I put there, or does that kind of go away once it's been done?
It's funny when you haven't looked at it in a while and you get to the scene and I'm thinking, oh, I don't remember this. I'm not picturing it. It's not coming into my mind like it did when I wrote it. And then you get into it a little bit and it's like, oh, and then you do start, because at first you're like, I'm reading it and putting it together based on the descriptions that are there. But then once I realize what the scene is, then I'm seeing it as I saw it, which is not always the way it is on the page, because like you visualize it and then you write it and then it goes through the editing process and it changes, or even sometimes it changes just in the description of it. So like the way I'm picturing it might not be served well by a description of it, you know what I mean? So you want to describe it more quickly or more efficiently or more colorfully sometimes. And so so sometimes those details, even sometimes a description of a character will change as I'm so there's and when I, you know, so I might still have this concept of the character in my head that is not how I actually describe them. So
That's that's very funny. I don't know that I've like really heard somebody speak to that before. In that sense of like, I never thought about how like a whole description could change for you.
because you're also writing towards, like, I'm always conscious of the language of it and the rhythm of the sentence and the sounds of the words together. I mean, there's a certain kind of you know, something you want. I think we want our work to be somewhat poetical, whether it's to be florid or ornamental, or whether it's to be swift and efficient. You know, all of that is a kind of you're writing with an eye towards putting words together in a way that that they work together, right? So
Yeah.
so sometimes the description it ends up being more in service to the sounds of the words than the picture in my head.
What you're actually thinking about. Yeah. I was wondering, as a reader, we always, I feel like we get to sit down and consume books, you know, rather quickly. Even if we're reading it over a period of time, like the collective amount of hours that we spend on a book has a general average, and it's significantly shorter than the amount of time that you've spent writing said book. And I'm always sad when I close the pages, and especially with Titanic Survivors Book Club, like I was just sad that I didn't get to hang out with these characters anymore. That my time with them was done. And so I always think about what that must be like for you as an author. And so I was wondering, I feel like I've asked a couple different authors this question, and it's really interesting to hear how everybody can vary in their relationship with the book and the characters at any given time of like, were you kind of ready to be done with them? Or were you also a little sad and missed spending time with them on a daily basis?
Oh yeah, I mean, every book I write, when I'm writing it, I could just spend the rest of my life writing that book, you know. So so yeah, I do kind of you know, create a space in my imagination where I like to go, where I like to be. And so it is a kind of, I don't know, maybe this is too corny, but you know, it is like a kind of psychotherapy sometimes. You know, maybe that's too ostentatious, but I do like just, I mean, for me, writing is about going into a place where everything else falls away. You know what I mean? So I'm not stressed out about this, that, or the other thing. Not stressed out about the world or work or whatnot, and it's just about like about escaping into figuring out how these characters are going to talk and what they're going to look like and how they're going to move and what they're going to wear and what they're going to feel and what the, you know, what's informing their hearts. And sometimes it's a matter of coming up for words for what's going on in my own heart or what I've had my, you know, things I've had trouble excavating in my own life and trying to define that in a sense, or to find words for it, and that can be interesting and soothing, and yeah, like I said, kind of therapeutic. And so yeah, so there's, but then once the book is out there in the world, then I am ready to move on to the next
Okay.
one. If I have to stop it, then it's kind of done.
Yeah. On your, yeah, I've heard authors answer a couple different ways. Like I said, like sometimes Tessa Bailey, who's a big romance author, like she was like, yeah, I still miss them and I revisit them on Saturday mornings. Like I think about like what they're doing. And then another time I've asked a different author and they were like, I was very done. Lovingly, I'm done. And they were being clear, like they were like, because when it goes out into the world, it feels like they are no longer my characters. They are for all of you. And so I have a different relationship with them than I had when I was writing them. And that's where I'm ready to be done with it, because it is no longer just mine. So
And
I think
I shouldn't say this, but like as when I was rereading it, there were parts of it that I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. I like that, like, or I like being back in this space, or I remember what, the imaginative space that particular section took up. But I also kind of like towards the end, I'm like, I got a little frustrated with the narrator. I did sort of feel like, oh, he needs to get over himself a little bit.
I absolutely love you saying that. It's so hilarious too. I don't think that's how we feel, but I think it's very fair that you feel. That is,
Well, but we do. I mean, we do sometimes get frustrated with the characters in books that we love, nonetheless, right? And
exactly.
that's
Yeah.
part of the process of interpretation. And
Well, and I think that more speaks to your crafting of your characters and to him as a character. Like if we can love him and be frustrated with him, because that feels like a very human feeling that we have with many of the people that we care about in our lives. And you still look at them and you're like, get over it. Like, what are we doing here? What is going on? Why are you being so whiny? Why are you XYZ? And so I feel like that's just you being a very human character for us to probably find both too relatable sometimes. And, I think it's very brave that you were able to reread your book. I don't feel that everybody is able to accomplish that task.
yeah, I mean, it's well, and I was talking to you before we started the the, the streaming, but there is a line of dialogue that's missing from the first edition. So if you buy the first edition, you have a collectible item, because it's going into a second printing. So it's that particular line.
Congratulations that it's going to second printing. That's
Thank you. Yeah, and it will have the missing line. But I've been at book signings, I've been writing it in, because and I didn't, and like I was telling you, it's just like you go through this process where there's copy editors involved and editors, and I'm rereading it and rereading it and rereading it, and you're double checking the facts and making sure everything's historically accurate. And the amount of time I spend trying to make sure things are historically accurate, and then just a few sentences vanish somehow in the process. And it was the audiobook actor who asked about it. He said, well, it seems like she's responding to something he didn't say. It's like, sure enough. So
That's so
in
wild.
case you're curious, it's on page 224. So if you get to page 224 and you're like, well, it's missing a line.
I love yeah, I think that we still have first prints. So if people want a collectible, we got you. Before we go into the second print run. This does bring up the other thing that we haven't talked about with your book, and I definitely want to make sure we cover it before we get off today, which is just a thing that I've gotten to hear people comment on, especially as they come in and look at our new release shelf, is how much they love the cover. And were you involved in the cover at all, or was that shown to you, or like what is the process for the making of this cover? Because it is something that I feel people are really drawn to, and it's really helping us be able to hand sell it.
Yeah, well, they always ask. They send you like a kind of author questionnaire, and they're curious about what kind of covers you like, or what you sense might be a cover. And I suspect there's a lot of writers who are really invested in that and probably fill that form out in great detail, and perhaps have sketches. So I just say I trust the designers. You have better instincts about what the book needs in that regard. And so, because yeah, like you're saying, the publisher wants to publish books that the bookseller will put cover out, that they'll put on display, and so I was just extremely happy with the cover when I saw it, and I had already, since I was working with my editor as I was writing it, she already had the first 100 pages, and they were all polished up and ready to go, and I got the cover then. And so I had time then to incorporate some elements of the cover into the text itself. So it was, so that was a unique aspect of it. But the cover references an actual book that was on the Titanic, that there had been this bejeweled edition of the Rubaiyat that this London bookbinder had created, and he'd sold it for thousands of dollars to a buyer in New York. And so it was in the storage of the Titanic, and was lost to the bottom of the sea.
I was really upset when I learned. I did not know. I think that was more upsetting for me than the necklace. I do wish, I know it was like not necessarily the process that everybody goes through, but I think it's really fascinating that you were writing the book in the way that you wrote that alongside your editor, and that you were able to then incorporate the cover back in, because that was a really interesting thing to have as a reader to experience, that it is now, only learned that after having read it. I'm like going through and thinking about how that would have not changed a ton for me, but it was a very cool factor that I think really adds a specialness to the book. And I wish maybe in some ways as the reader that was something that you got to do more often. I don't know if you like you need to go through the process that you went through as an author, but
it's a book about books, and so the idea that the more the book can play a part in the creating of the book and the structure of the book and the physical object of it, was really, I was captivated by that process as well. So yeah, it was a real, the writing of the book was kind of different than the way I've written other books, but it was also a real delight. Like, it was a real unique experience that I treasure.
Okay. Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're going to wrap up soon, but I have one last question for you. But I don't know how much you'll be able to answer it, so it's totally okay if you can't tell us anything. But I'd hate to get off this live without asking if you can tell us anything about what you're working on now, even if it's just saying that, yes, you're working on something.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's I move into 1920s Manhattan, and so it's as it stands now, a ballerina in exile orchestrates a jewel heist in Prohibition era Manhattan. So
let's go. Yeah. Do you get to visit Manhattan as research for this project, or?
I plan on spending some time there, and at the New York Public Library, where I've done research before for other projects. But yeah, I love New York.
If people don't love New York, I think that's a bad opinion, but we're a little biased from a publishing standpoint. I hear that too. Yeah. But it is a great city. That's really exciting. I cannot wait to hear more about it. But in the meantime, everybody, you get to experience the Titanic Survivors Book Club. The Novel Neighbor does have copies, so if you're in St. Louis, you can pop into the store, and we would love to hand sell it to you. But if you're not in St. Louis, also, please don't worry, we do ship. So that is something, if you go online I'll put it up right here, to thenovelneighbor.com and just type in the Titanic Survivors Book Club to the search bar, we will be able to get that book to you, and we would love to ship it to you. And then you can come back and tell us everything you've thought about it and how much you loved it, because I'm convinced there's no other experience that people can have. Timothy, it's amazing. I love your book so much. Thank you so much for doing this very fun live with us. I guess we didn't cover that it kind of ironically turned out to be April 14th that we were doing this.
Right, the day that the Titanic hit the iceberg, and then the wee hours of April 15th it went under. So this is your taxes are due on the same day that the Titanic sank. So
that's appropriate. It feels like that really is an interesting coincidence every year. But that was not necessarily Well, maybe you were masterminding that all along, but that was not necessarily, that really worked out. So kind of, if you're a mood reader or a thematic reader, this is kind of the perfect season to pick up this book. And like I said, you can get it from us, the Novel Neighbor. And also, Timothy, if you got, I was like, I forgot what I was going to say next, but just amazing author page. And I would encourage people to go check out your author website and just get to read more about you and your books. And if you are reading, if this is your first Timothy Schaffert book that you have read, you need to go back and read his entire backlist. Again, I'll keep talking about The Perfume Thief until the day's end. So definitely encourage that as well. But anything for you to say, Timothy, before we sign off today?
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. This has been a real pleasure, and I'm so grateful to the booksellers and their support.
Thank you. That means a lot. I hope you have a great rest of your semester. Is it over soon? Are you almost done?
We don't have too much longer, but yeah, we're leaning towards wrapping things up.
Okay. Well, I wish you the best for the rest of your semester and your writing time over the summer.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good night. I almost said good night, everyone. It's just the afternoon. Have a great rest of your evenings.